I'm going to hand over now to Cristina Escobar to speak, especially now whilst we've got the connection with her. So fingers crossed the connection has prevailed from Cuba. Cristina, the floor is yours.
So the first point of understanding this is that this is happening in the middle of a pandemic where a lot of people are indoors, are staying home. And there's a boom of the usage of platforms like WhatsApp, Telegram, Twitter, and Facebook, because people are getting online, socializing, getting information, buying food, we have like a Cuber, like kind of an Uber service on WhatsApp. So a lot of people are connecting, and it's a real thing that the numbers are around 5 to 6 million people are frequently using online platforms of some sort. And as it gets more cheaper, so is the way people get connected. So this is in a context in which we're every day more similar to the rest of the world of being more highly connected. And then we are living now, we're experiencing years of Donald Trump's policies, not himself, of course, but the people behind him, a quite strong Republican Party in South Florida, and a lot of money dedicated, if before used to be towards small groups of people within the island with not a lot of recognition among the Cuban population, which had a lot of attention from abroad, but not inside. This kind of perspective of sponsoring opposition groups, creating opposition groups, creating symbolism and legitimacy around them, has shifted towards different ways of creating subversion, dominating the narrative, and creating either sponsoring, pushing for a division between the government and the party and the people. So this is quite an interesting thing. It can be described in different ways. First, through social media. And what I'm talking about is dedicating money, and this is all public. And Max Blumenthal wrote an amazing piece on this, quite well, are a lot of arguments, very clear how the money from the American constituencies is being used to and channeled through different ways, USAID, State Department's kind of fellowships, or just dedicated money to specific groups. All of them have in common regime change agenda, all of them, in different ways, with apparently different faces, different platforms, different audiences. And what's interesting is that this money is dedicated to social media to create and sponsor and put money onto labs of promoting, distributing, viralizing contents specifically against Cuba, offenses to the Cuban government, creating an image of chaos, calling for or creating, using influencers like actresses or musicians to promote hashtags specifically dedicated to topics like Cuba, all usually, as is very common, using hashtags and using symbols of caring for the Cuban people and with a humanitarian cover. But as a matter of fact, you see that they say, okay, we care about Matanzas, for example, which was a province that has been hit quite badly by the pandemic. But then once they get what they want, they just forget about Matanzas or any other province that might be experiencing quite a bad situation with the pandemic. So you see that these are excuses that they're using to actually push for an agenda. And then there's a group of media, it is called, and they have labeled themselves as independent media. But as a matter of fact, they are paid. This is public. And this is something quite funny now also. In the past, people who were against the Cuban government used to say, even if it was a lie, that they had no links with the American government, State Department, or any money that comes from the American government. Now it's kind of normal, recognizing that as a matter of fact, yes, we do receive money from a foreign government to create to call for an intervention and to create subversion or political opposition against the Cuban government. So from being a reason, from being something that you hide, now is something that you say openly, which it gives you the idea of what's become normal in this discourse and in this confrontation. This group of media, most of them have the same agenda. They talk about fake news. They use the reality of news. Usually they use a thing that, as a matter of fact, happened in Cuba or not, and they take it out of proportion, out of context, and they create a big fuss about it. They work quite fine. They work very well with Google SEO. They work quite fine also in a very particular way on social media, and they get shared a lot. They all have Cuba in their names, and they kind of kidnap the narrative around what's going on in this country. With the July 11th events, which was a combination of things. First, these campaigns on social media. Second, of saying that Cuba is a chaos and it's impossible to live in this country, and that everyone is against the government. None of these absolute phrases are true. There's people against the government. There's criticism against the government. There's criticism against how the pandemic has been dealt with, but this is not something that is a popular sentiment. It's focused on groups. And then with the July 11th situation, what also happened was that a lot of people, essentially impoverished neighborhoods, groups that usually have been, let's say, less benefit by the social programs of the Cuban government or the Cuban Revolution, people who have been victims of the inequalities created after the falling of the Soviet Union, specifically with the economic measures during the special period. So there is inequality in a third world country, as we are. Cuba is a third world country. And some of these groups, essentially people with black skins or darker skin, people with no college education, these people, these groups, these neighborhoods have been weaponized against the Cuban government, used against the Cuban government. And they've been fed with this narrative out of actual argument like freedom and independence, and that saying again and again that all they want is freedom. When you ask them what they actually want, is actually you find a lot of concepts, a lot of ideas. It's not a clear path of what it is. And this is because they've been fed with this narrative that what you need is freedom. And so and when you ask them, it's actually not very clear. So this hasn't been a spontaneous uprising, what happened on July 11th. This hasn't been like it just happened because people were sick of how things were. This was carefully curated to happen on July 11th. They even have a logo, like a couple of hours after the first riot happened, they already had like an entire communication platform created. So this is, when you study profoundly what happened on July 11th, you realize the scope of the campaign, the scope of the war, and the amount of money, resources, and intellectual resources put behind this. And this is why this context is more complicated than ever, because it's, and I'm not saying that there aren't internal problems. And of course, this is part of the things that were weaponized against the government. A lot of the things that are happening here, as a matter of fact, are happening elsewhere. A pandemic, a lack of oxygen in a moment, like it happened in Ecuador, like it has happened even in the United States. Because we're living in a pandemic that has taken the biggest economies in the world haven't been able to deal with this without losing people, without seeing the problems even in public system of healthcare, like in Spain or even the UK. But what I'm saying is that, of course, there's a combination of crisis, the lack of tourism, a lot of informal economy, a lot of families fed from tourism, even if it was not directly with the touristic industry. The enforcement of the sanctions is sad, and I'm sure a lot of people here have seen the all Havana full of tourists and full of people. It's sad to see how the emptiness of the Havana since Trump stopped all the cruise ships and made harder for American visitors to get to Cuba. And this affected, because the narrative, okay, this affects only the government. This is not true in any way. It means targeting specific families and people who are also suffering. And the other thing, and I will end with this because I'm more interested in listening to the many interesting people here. The other interesting thing here is how this campaign has had a very particular aim at the emotions. So suddenly it's all about the blood on the streets, which I haven't seen in Cuba. Suddenly it's about fighting for principles and freedom. So when you listen to it, it seems like the discourse of the Cuban Revolution in the 50s and the dictatorship of Batista. So it looked like that, because in a way they are kidnapping that discourse. They're taking that discourse from themselves, not with a lot of content in it, but what is very particular, and always it repeats in the agenda of different voices, even the clusters of media in South Florida, or Marco Rubio, the Republican senator, or all the right-wing voices, or even people here inside Cuba. All they see is that the US will save Cuba from what's going on. So it has an interventionist perspective. And my main worry around all of this, besides the sadness, I have to say, that around the events of July 11th, because it was sad to see something that I never saw in my own country, in my own neighborhood. I was born in one of the neighborhoods in which a lot of the images became viral. It's the breakage, the divorce between Cubans and the Cuban community abroad. That's the strategy, to divide the Cuban community abroad and the Cuban community inside the island, because it's a way of making us weaker and create this idea that you Cubans who live on the island, you have to uprise against the government, and then if you do that, then we will consider you legit. And it's a contamination, it's a toxic discourse that meddles between the relations of between families, between father and daughter, or siblings, and it's something that has divided families. And it's very sad, and that's why it's so important, the communication, and that's why it's so important to get objective information and to put all of this in context, to understand that spending so much time on the phone is a major problem everywhere, but now in Cuba it's even bigger, because again, I remember when internet connection was not that available in Cuba, we were all very worried, and all the people that asked for, including myself, that we need more internet access and more stable and better internet access, is because we need to be in this battle of the image of Cuba being manipulated and misunderstood all the time. But now, yes, we're there, okay, but we are not, we are outnumbered, and the amount of resources and the level of planning of the people trying to win this symbolic, the phrase, the first victim in a war is truth. And this applies perfectly in the case of Cuba. And every time you listen to someone speaking about, okay, I don't know, this musician that I used to like suddenly is against the Cuban government, and this other person, you always have to find the interests, the agenda behind, and the emotions, and the reasons behind certain positions and certain discourses. Because in these times, it's harder than ever to understand what's going on in this country. And that's why I thank you guys for organizing this, and I'm open to questions and listening to the other presenters.
Thank you so much, Cristina. I thought it was really interesting what you're saying about the narrative being hijacked, because we've seen the same thing in Bolivia, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, and it's also part of trying to confuse the international support for Cuba. So I hope we can pick back up on that theme in the discussion. I just also wanted to say thank you for your continued reporting. As Ruby has posted in the chat, and you can hear Cristina's Cuba Today program in English and regularly on Radio Havana, Cuba. And I really recommend anybody who wants to get, that objective understanding of what's happening in Cuba in bite-sized English, please follow that website.